of the hallmarks of the Cárdenas presidency is indigenismo. So policies drawn up and implemented mostly by non-Indians that are supposedly favorable to Indians. So this is something else that Cárdenas tries to impose, and it doesn't go over very well in Chiapas because there's so much opposition posed by so many powerful people. Ecuador had a very weak indigenista movement, and so as early as the 1930s and 40s, you see indigenous people themselves outflanking the indigenistas, who tended to be non-indigenous. So it's sort of interesting to see how the countries that had the weakest indigenista movements created the most potent indigenous political movements in the 1980s, 90s, and up to the present. On the other hand, in Mexico was the hemispheric leader in indigenismo in the 1950s and 60s. And so because Mexico was creating institutes that were supposed to be dealing with indigenous issues, we can argue about whether they did any good at all, right? But because the government was creating these institutes and hiring people to go out and serve as agronomers and nurses and teachers and this sort of thing, the argument is that these countries were late in developing their own indigenous, autonomous indigenous political movements. So the countries that had the most vigorous, sort of potent, important indigenista movements were able to channel indigenous discontent through state agencies. But in a place like Ecuador, where the state didn't bother funding indigenista institutions, the indigenous people actually forged alliances with working class mestizos in the cities and began advancing, and these were leftist movements, so they began advancing a leftist agenda because the indigenista movement was so impotent. I think the Zapatista rebellion is the death blow to indigenismo in Mexico. So it says, look, what we've been doing for the last 40 plus years has failed. We need to start all over again or scrap the project altogether. So the Zapatista rebellion in 1994, I think, is the death blow to Mexican indigenismo. And the INI was officially disbanded in 2003, and a new institute has taken its place. It's called the CDI, the National Commission for the Development of Indigenous Peoples, but it's decentralized and kind of, most people don't really think that it's got much of an agenda or is doing much good. In parts of Chiapas today, and they've been pretty much, I think, in recent years left alone and even ignored by the federal government and by the state government. That doesn't mean that there aren't still skirmishes now and again, usually people fighting over land. But the Zapatista movement has been critical for anyone who studies modern Chiapas. The 1994 movement is really a watershed, and it's certainly a watershed for Mexican indigenismo. So my first book looked at the Mexican Revolution and the 2 decades that followed it, the 1920s and 30s. So this second project kind of, in a way, picks up where the first one left off. So in a nutshell, the book looks at the first 25 years of the INI's pilot coordinating center in Chiapas, and it tries to project conclusions onto all of Mexico. Well, what I'm trying to do with this 25-year history is to trace the rise and fall of this coordinating center. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to argue that the rise and fall of the coordinating center in Chiapas is kind of sets the pattern for the rise and fall of the other 89 coordinating centers that were opened in Mexico in and most of them were opened in the 1970s, actually. So I'm trying to project the fate of the INI in Chiapas onto the rest of the country. And you know, actually I haven't finished my chapters on the 1970s, so I'm on thin ice here, but you know, it's interesting to see the federal government suddenly opening all of these coordinating centers from 70 to 76 at a time when, I mean, by 1970 it was already clear that the coordinating center in Chiapas was not going to amount to much. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, then why would the federal government invest so much money, so much time and resources and energy into a project that had already shown in Chiapas that it was not going to really successfully develop or integrate indigenous people into the Mexican mainstream, which is what the INI tried to do. I mean, so right now I'm working on chapter 7. I anticipate 11 chapters, and I have things, you know, shreds written here and there, little scraps here and there. I'd like to be done by winter break of the next winter break. So January 2013. Then, you know, you send the manuscript first to your friends, and then you send it to presses and hope that someone bites. You know, yeah. It's a story that I think, well, indigenismo in Mexico has been pretty much panned by modern researchers, social scientists. You know, it's seen as this very paternalistic, almost colonial project of assimilation. But I find that there are some nuances to the story that haven't been told. And I'm trying to sort of set the record straight and talk about some of the innovations of indigenista policy in the 1950s and some of what they tried to do. I'm also trying to highlight the opposition that these people ran into. I mean, you know, death threats and you know, the local elite in Chiapas didn't take kindly to they call them foreigners, people from Mexico City coming in and telling them how to treat their Indians.